The rain drummed against the windows of Riverside Animal Shelter with a persistence that seemed to echo the desperation within its walls. Inside Kennel 47, an aging German shepherd named Ranger lay curled on a thin faded blanket that had seen better days. Much like himself, his coat, once a lustrous blend of black and tan, now bore the silver threads of his 8 years, and his dark eyes, which had once held the fierce intelligence of his breed, seemed dulled by the weight of abandonment. "One's been here 6 months, whispered Sarah, a young volunteer, as she passed by with a mop bucket. "Nobody wants the older ones." Ranger's ears twitched at the familiar refrain he'd heard it countless times, the hushed conversations about his age, his slight limp, his difficult nature. The staff meant well, but their words cut deeper than any physical wound. He shifted position, trying to ease the ache in his right hip, a reminder of his past service that no one here seemed to remember or care about. Shelter was overcrowded as always. Puppies yapped excitedly from the front kennels, their energy and youth making them irresistible to potential adopters. The middle-aged dogs barked and paced, desperate to catch someone's attention, but here in the back where the difficult cases were housed, silence reigned. Supreme Ranger had learned that desperation only pushed people away. Across town, Daniel Hayes sat in his cramped studio apartment, staring at the same 4 walls that had witnessed his daily struggle for the past 3 years. At 48, the former Army sergeant carried invisible wounds that ran deeper than the shrapnel scar on his left leg. The nightmares came less frequently now, but the loneliness was a constant companion, as reliable as the disability check that arrived each month. His therapist, Dr. Martinez, had suggested getting a pet. "Companionship can be therapeutic," she'd said, during their last session. "Something to care for, to give your days purpose." Daniel had scoffed then, but as the weeks passed and the silence in his apartment grew more oppressive, her words echoed in his mind. The idea of visiting the animal shelter had been brewing for days, though Daniel couldn't quite articulate what he was looking for. Maybe a small dog, something easy to manage, something that wouldn't ask too much of him, because he wasn't sure how much he had left to give them. Bus ride to Riverside Animal Shelter took 20 minutes through neighborhoods that had seen better days. Daniel's cane tapped rhythmically against the floor as the vehicle lurched through potholes, each jolt sending a familiar spike of pain through his damaged leg. He almost turned back twice, uncertainty gnawing at him like an old wound. The shelter's lobby was a cacophony of barking, mewing, and human chatter. Bright fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in a harsh, clinical glow. Daniel approached the front desk, where a harried-looking woman in her 50s was juggling phone calls and paperwork. "First time here?" she asked, barely glancing up. "The puppies are in section of small dogs, and the cats are upstairs. If you're interested him, just looking," Daniel said quietly. "Sure, hun, take your time. Just sign in here." She pushed a clipboard toward him with the efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Daniel started with the puppies, as most visitors did. They were adorable, tumbling over each other in their enthusiasm to be noticed, but their energy was overwhelming, their needs too demanding for someone who could barely manage his own daily routine. The small dogs were calmer, but seemed fragile, delicate creatures that might break under the weight of his own brokenness. He found himself wandering toward the back of the shelter, drawn by something he couldn't name. The kennels here were quieter, housing dogs that had given up on the desperate attention-seeking that characterized the front sections. A sign reading "Special Needs" hung above this section, though Daniel noticed it was really just a euphemism for hard-to-place stats. When he saw him, Kennel 47 housed a German shepherd who lay on his side, seemingly oblivious to Daniel's presence. The dog was larger than Daniel had been considering, his coat showing the silver of age, his body carrying the subtle stiffness of years. There was something dignified about his stillness, a quiet resignation that Daniel recognized in his own reflection. "That's Ranger," said a voice behind him. Daniel turned to find a young man in volunteer scrubs. "He's been here a while, sweet dog," but the volunteer shrugged the gesture, saying everything that words couldn't. Daniel stepped closer to the kennel. At the sound of footsteps, Ranger lifted his head, and their eyes met. In that moment, something passed between them, a recognition of shared pain, of battles fought and lost, to the weariness that comes from being discarded by a world that once needed you. Slowly, carefully, Ranger rose to his feet. Daniel could see the slight favor of his right leg, the careful way he moved. The dog approached the front of the kennel with measured steps, never breaking eye contact. When he reached the chain-link barrier, he sat with the precision of military training that few would recognize, but Daniel knew intimately he was a working dog. Daniel said more statement than question. The volunteer looked surprised. "How did you?" "Yeah, police K9 got retired early due to some hip issues. His handler couldn't keep him, and well," another shrug, another story of abandonment, dressed up in bureaucratic language. Daniel knelt down despite the protest from his bad leg, bringing himself closer to Ranger's level. The dog's nose pressed against the chain link, and Daniel extended his fingers. Ranger sniffed cautiously, then gently licked Daniel's knuckles with a warm, rough tongue. "Hello, soldier." Daniel whispered. Ranger's tail gave a tentative wag, the first sign of hope Daniel had seen in those dark eyes. "You interested in meeting him?" the volunteer asked, pulling out a set of keys. "We have a meet 10 greet room." Daniel nodded, unable to trust his voice, as the kennel door opened. Ranger stepped out with careful dignity, his training evident in every movement. He waited patiently as a slip lead was placed around his neck, then walked beside the volunteer with the precise heel that spoke of years of discipline in the small meeting room. Daniel sat on a plastic chair while Ranger explored the space with methodical thoroughness. After a few minutes, the dog approached Daniel's chair, and with a gentleness that belied his size, placed his large head on Daniel's knee. The weight of it was surprisingly comforting. Daniel's hand found the soft spot behind Ranger's ears, scratching gently. The dog's eyes closed, and for the first time in months, the constant knot of tension in Daniel's chest began to loosen. How long has he been here? Daniel asked. 6 months, the volunteer replied. To be honest, we were starting to discuss other options. He's 8 years old, has some medical needs, and the space. He didn't finish the sentence. Daniel understood. In his years of military service, he'd seen enough other options to know what that euphemism meant. The thought of this dignified creature being put down because no one wanted an old soldier made something fierce and protective rise in Daniel's chest. What does that mean? It means the county owes Ranger his medical care. I have been in touch with the current K9 unit commander, Captain Rodriguez. She's horrified by what happened and wants to make it right. The department is prepared to cover all of Ranger's medical expenses. Daniel's grip tightened on the phone. Dead serious. There's more though. Morrison is facing disciplinary action for his handling of Ranger's retirement, and there might be criminal charges if they can prove he deliberately abandoned a working animal. The news should have filled Daniel with relief, but instead he felt the strange numbness that comes with shock after days of fighting impossible odds. Victory felt almost surreal. Tome. I don't know what to say. Didn't say anything. Just get that dog the help he needs. I'll email you Captain Rodriguez's contact information. She wants to speak with you first thing tomorrow morning. After hanging up, Daniel sat in silence, staring at Ranger. The dog was watching him with those intelligent dark eyes, and Daniel could swear he saw understanding there, as if Ranger somehow knew that the tide had turned. Looks like justice isn't dead after all, buddy. Daniel whispered, his hand finding the soft spot behind Ranger's ears, but even as relief flooded through him, Daniel's soldier instincts were screaming. Warnings, good news, had a way of being followed by bad news. In his experience, he tried to push down the anxiety, but Thursday night passed in restless vigilance. Friday morning arrived with disaster. Daniel woke to the sound of Ranger's labored breathing. The dog was lying on his side, his body rigid with pain, his eyes wide and glassy. When Daniel knelt beside him, Ranger couldn't lift his head. Oh, God, no, not now. Not when we're so close. Daniel's hands shook as he called the emergency clinic. Dr. Chen answered on the second ring, and her voice was grim when Daniel described Ranger's condition. Bring him in immediately. It sounds like his condition has taken a critical turn. The drive to the clinic was a nightmare of traffic lights and morning commute. Traffic. Daniel had Ranger wrapped in a blanket in the passenger seat, the dog's breathing shallow and labored. Every red light felt like an eternity, every slow driver an obstacle between Ranger and survival. Stay with me, Daniel kept repeating. You've made it this far. Don't give up now. The clinic. Ranger was immediately taken into surgery. Dr. Chen explained that his condition had deteriorated overnight, and they needed to operate immediately or risk losing him entirely. The good news is that we can now proceed with both surgeries at once, she said. The county has authorized full coverage, and we have a specialist coming in to handle the spinal procedure. But Daniel barely heard the logistics. All he could focus on was the image of Ranger being wheeled away on a gurney, still conscious but too weak to lift his head, his trust in Daniel evident, even in extremist. The waiting began. Daniel called. Marcus called. Tom called. Captain Rodriguez. He sat in the surgery waiting room with Ranger's worn collar clutched in his hands, the familiar weight of it, a tangible connection to the dog fighting for his life behind closed doors. Hours passed. Other pet owners came and went, their own dramas playing out in whispered conversations with veterinary staff. Daniel watched it all through a haze of exhaustion and fear, his mind cycling through every moment he'd shared with Ranger, every sign he might have missed, every way he could have prevented this crisis. At 3 p.m, Dr. Chen emerged from surgery looking exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The surgery went well, she said, sitting down beside Daniel. We were able to repair the hip dysplasia and address the spinal compression. The next 24 hours will be critical, but Ranger is stable. Daniel's legs went weak with relief. Can I see him? He's still sedated, but yes, I should warn you, he'll be disoriented and in pain when he wakes up. But that's normal. Ranger lay on his side in a recovery kennel, an IV line running into his front leg, his breathing deep and regular under anesthesia. His back legs were shaved and bandaged, and he looked smaller, somehow vulnerable in a way that Daniel had never seen. Hey, soldier, Daniel whispered, his hand finding a spot on Ranger's head. That wasn't covered in medical equipment. You did it. You made it through. The dog's eyelids fluttered at the sound of Daniel's voice, but he didn't wake. Daniel stayed with him until visiting hours. He ended talking softly about home, about the future, about all the walks they'd take when Ranger was healed. The next 24 hours were the longest of Daniel's life. He called the clinic every few hours, checking on Ranger's progress. The dog had woken from surgery but was heavily medicated for pain. He was eating small amounts and had managed to stand briefly, but recovery would be a long process. On Sunday, Daniel was finally allowed to bring Ranger home. The dog was weak and moved carefully, but his eyes held an alertness that had been missing for weeks. The surgery had been a success, and while full recovery would take months of physical therapy and careful monitoring, the prognosis was excellent. As they settled into their apartment, Ranger moving gingerly to his bed with Daniel's help, both of them seemed to understand that they had crossed some invisible threshold. They had faced the worst together and survived. Welcome home, Daniel said, his hand resting gently on Ranger's back. For the first time in weeks, Ranger's tail managed a weak but genuine wag. The hardest battle was over, but Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that their story was far from finished. Ranger was safe, but the system that had failed him was still out there, still capable of discarding other veterans and canine who had given their service and deserved better in return. As he settled in for his first full night's sleep in days, Daniel made a mental note to call Captain Rodriguez in the morning. There were questions that needed answers, and Ranger deserved more than just medical treatment. He deserved justice. But that was tomorrow's fight. Tonight, it was enough that they were both home, both healing, and both no longer alone. 3 weeks after Ranger's surgery, life had settled into a comfortable rhythm of recovery and rehabilitation. The dog's physical therapy sessions were going well, his incision sites had healed cleanly, and his appetite had returned with a vengeance. More importantly, Ranger seemed to have reclaimed some essential part of himself that had been lost during his months at the shelter: a confidence, a joy in simple pleasures, a willingness to trust that good things might actually last. Daniel had also begun to heal in ways he hadn't expected. Caring for Ranger through his recovery had given Daniel's days structure and purpose. The twice-daily physical therapy sessions, the careful monitoring of medication schedules, the gradual increase in exercise, all of it had pulled Daniel out of the isolation that had defined his life for 3 years. They were both stronger, both more hopeful, and both settling into the belief that maybe, just maybe, they had found their permanent home together. Then Patricia Vance showed up at Daniel's door. It was a Tuesday morning, unseasonably warm for late autumn, and Daniel was helping Ranger through his morning stretching routine when the knock came. Ranger's ears perked up, and he managed to rise to his feet with only minimal assistance, a small victory that had become part of their daily celebration of progress. Probably just a mail carrier, Daniel said, but something in Ranger's body language suggested otherwise. The dog was alert but not anxious, curious rather than defensive. Daniel opened the door to find Patricia Vance from Riverside Animal Shelter, standing on his doorstep, clipboard in hand, her expression carefully neutral in the way of bureaucrats bearing unwelcome news. Mr. Hayes, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to discuss Ranger's adoption. Daniel's grip tightened on the doorknob. What about it? May I come in? May I come in? Every instinct Daniel had developed in years of military service was screaming warnings. Patricia's tone was too careful, too formal, and her eyes kept flicking toward Ranger with an expression that looked uncomfortably like calculation. I'd prefer to handle whatever this is out here, Daniel said. Patricia sighed, as if dealing with a difficult child. Mr. Hayes, I'm afraid there's been an irregularity with Ranger's adoption. We've discovered that certain protocols weren't followed, and we need to discuss the possibility of returning him to the shelter for proper reprocessing. Words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Returning him? What are you talking about? The paperwork wasn't completed correctly, and there are questions about whether you're equipped to handle a dog with Ranger's particular needs. His medical needs are being handled by the county, Daniel said, his voice rising. He's had surgery, he's in physical therapy, and he's doing better than he has in months. Yes, well, that's part of the problem. Patricia shifted uncomfortably, and Daniel caught a glimpse of what this was really about. The shelter has received some criticism about our policies regarding special needs. Animals having a high-profile success story walk away without proper documentation makes us look negligent. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. You want to take him back for your own public relations? I wouldn't put it quite like that. Then how would you put it? Daniel stepped forward, and Patricia took an involuntary step back. Because it sounds to me like you're trying to steal a dog who's been through hell, just so you can parade him around as proof that you care about animals. You were ready to euthanize 6 months ago. Behind Daniel, Ranger had moved to the doorway. The dog was still moving carefully, but there was something unmistakably protective in his posture as he positioned himself between Daniel and the stranger who was causing his human distress. Patricia's eyes fixed on Ranger, and her expression grew more determined. Mr. Hayes, I understand you've grown attached, but the fact remains that Ranger is legally still the property of Riverside Animal Shelter until the proper procedures are followed. If you refuse to cooperate, I'll have to involve animal control. On what grounds? Improper documentation, failure to complete adoption procedures, and Patricia paused, consulting her clipboard. Concerns about the adopter's ability to provide adequate care for a special needs animal. Daniel felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. The same feeling he'd had when VA administrators suggested that his disability claims might be exaggerated, or when discharge review boards questioned whether his injuries were so It was the feeling of being betrayed by the very systems that were supposed to protect him. Get off my property, Daniel said quietly. Mr. Hayes, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation. If you don't cooperate voluntarily, I'll be forced to get off my property. Patricia took another step back, but her expression remained determined. You have 24 hours to bring Ranger back to the shelter, or I'll be returning with animal control officers and a court order. Think carefully about whether you want to put yourself and that dog through a legal battle. You can't win. She turned and walked away, leaving Daniel standing in his doorway with Ranger pressed against his leg, both of them staring at the bureaucratic threat that had just walked into their lives. For a moment, Daniel felt the familiar paralysis that had dominated the first years after his discharge. The sense of being caught in a system too large and indifferent to fight. But then Ranger's weight shifted against his leg, and Daniel looked down into dark eyes that held absolute trust, complete faith that Daniel would protect him from whatever forces were gathering against them. Not happening, Daniel said aloud. Not today, not ever. The next 20 hours passed in a whirlwind of phone calls and preparation. Daniel contacted Tom Bradley, Captain Rodriguez, Marcus Webb, and every other ally he could think of. The story of Patricia's visit spread through the veteran community like wildfire, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. This is exactly the kind of bureaucratic bullshit we've all dealt with, Marcus said during one of several strategy calls. They ignore a problem until someone fixes it themselves. Then they want to take credit for the solution. Captain Rodriguez was even more direct. This is harassment, plain and simple. Ranger is legally your dog. His medical care is being provided by the county as compensation for the department's failure, and any attempt to remove him would be theft. Bradley, with his law enforcement background, provided the tactical analysis. Patricia Vance is overreaching her authority. The shelter has no legal standing to reclaim a properly adopted animal, especially one whose care is being funded by another government entity. But Daniel knew that legal standing and bureaucratic determination didn't always align. He'd seen too many cases where people with limited resources were ground down by systems with unlimited patience and taxpayer-funded lawyers. When Patricia returned the next morning, she brought company: 2 animal control officers and a clipboard thick with official-looking papers. Daniel was ready for them. He opened the door before they could knock. Ranger at his side, and found himself facing not just Patricia and the animal control officers, but also Tom Bradley, Captain Rodriguez in her official police uniform, and Marcus Webb, who had driven 6 hours overnight to be there. Ms. Vance, Captain Rodriguez said, her voice carrying the authority of 20 years in law enforcement, I understand you're here to illegally seize county property. Patricia's confident expression faltered. County property. K9 Ranger is a retired police working dog whose medical care is being funded by county taxpayers as part of his pension benefits. Any attempt to remove him from his registered handler would be theft of government property. But the shelter has no authority over retired working dogs, Tom Bradley interjected, producing his own clipboard. I've been in contact with the state attorney's office, and they're very interested in this case. Apparently there are regulations about the treatment of retired service animals that someone has been watched Patricia's face cycle through confusion, anger, and growing realization that she had badly miscalculated. The animal control officers were looking increasingly uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that they'd been dragged into a political battle disguised as a legal proceeding. Furthermore, Captain Rodriguez continued, Mr. Hayes is Ranger's legally registered handler under both county and state working dog statutes. The adoption through your shelter was simply a formality. Ranger was always meant to be placed with a qualified veteran. It wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough, and Daniel could see that Patricia knew she was outmaneuvered. The county will be conducting a full review of Riverside Animal Shelter's policies regarding working dog retirements, Tom added. We're particularly interested in cases where animals were marked for euthanasia. Despite the availability of appropriate placement programs, Patricia's face went pale. A county investigation into shelter policies could result in funding cuts, management changes, and the kind of public scrutiny that ended careers. Now, Captain Rodriguez said, her tone becoming almost conversational, I believe you have someplace else to. Beatty retreat was swift and complete. Patricia muttered something about misunderstandings and reviewing procedures, but she and the animal control officers were gone within minutes, leaving Daniel standing in his doorway with his unlikely group of defenders. That's it? Daniel asked, still not quite believing it was over. That's it, Tom confirmed, though I'd recommend getting Ranger officially registered as your service dog. It'll provide additional legal protections and make sure this never happens again. As the group prepared to leave, Captain Rodriguez pulled Daniel aside. You know, we've been talking about starting a program to place retired working dogs with veterans. Would you be interested in helping us develop it? Daniel looked down at Ranger, who was standing more confidently than he had in weeks, his tail wagging as he accepted congratulations and ear scratches from his defender's eye. Think we'd like that, Daniel said. That evening, as Daniel and Ranger settled into their routine of physical therapy and quiet companionship, Daniel reflected on how much had changed since that rainy day at the shelter. They had both been discarded, both written off, both considered too damaged or inconvenient to be worth the effort of salvation. But they had found each other, and in finding each other, they had discovered that healing was possible, that trust could be rebuilt, and that sometimes the best way to recover from betrayal is to prove your worth to someone who truly understands it. "To know what, Ranger?" Daniel said, his hand resting on the dog's back as they watched the sunset through their small apartment window. "I think we're going to be just fine." Ranger's tail thumped against the floor, and in that simple sound, Daniel heard agreement, contentment, and the promise of all the tomorrows they would face. Together, neither of them was unwanted anymore. They were home, they were family, and they were living proof that sometimes the best second chances come disguised as last chances, waiting in the quiet kennels and forgotten corners of the world for someone brave enough to believe in them. Outside, the city continued its daily rhythm of hurry and indifference, but inside their small apartment, two old soldiers had found their peace. They had fought their last battle together, and they had won not just victory, but something far more precious: the right to grow old with dignity, surrounded by love, and secure in the knowledge that they would never be abandoned again. "The end. What I need to do to adopt him?" The volunteer's eyebrows rose. "Are you sure? He's a big dog, and with his age and the hip issues, he might need special caring." "Sure." Daniel's voice carried a conviction he hadn't felt in years. "We're both a little broken, but maybe that's okay." As the paperwork was processed and adoption fees discussed, Daniel sat with Ranger in the quiet room. The dog had positioned himself close enough to maintain contact, but not so close as to be demanding. It was the behavior of someone who had learned not to ask for too much, not to hope too hard. "You and me, we're going to figure this out together," Daniel said softly, his hand still resting on Ranger's head. For the first time in 6 months, Ranger's tail wagged with something approaching joy when they walked out of the shelter together 2 hours later. The rain had stopped, and weak afternoon sunlight was trying to break through the clouds. Daniel carried a bag of donated food and supplies, while Ranger walked beside him with the steady gait of a soldier who had finally found his way home. Neither of them looked back at the building that had housed their separate loneliness. They had each other now, and that was enough to start with. As they waited for the bus, Ranger sat at perfect attention beside Daniel's chair, his warm presence a promise that neither of them would have to face their demons alone anymore. The first night was awkward in the way that all new beginnings are, filled with careful politeness and uncertain boundaries. Daniel had prepared as best he could, purchasing a dog bed, food bowls, and a few basic supplies during the 3-day waiting period while Ranger's adoption paperwork was processed. But now, standing in his small apartment with an 80-pound German shepherd, he realized that no amount of preparation could have readied him for this moment. Ranger stood just inside the doorway, taking in his new surroundings. With a methodical assessment of his training, his nose twitched as he catalogued the unfamiliar scents while his eyes swept a small space with professional thoroughness. Daniel watched, struck by how the dog's behavior mirrored his own. When entering a new environment, always alert, always calculating potential threats and exit strategies. "This is it," Daniel said, his voice sounding too loud in the quiet apartment. Not much, but its home. Ranger's ears flicked toward him at the sound, but the dog remained where he was, waiting for permission or instruction. It was clear he had been well trained, but it was equally clear he had learned not to take liberties, not to assume welcome where it might not exist. Daniel set down the bag of supplies and awkwardly gestured toward the living area. "You can, look around, make yourself comfortable." But Ranger didn't move, and Daniel realized he was going to have to be more direct. Years of military service had taught both of them to respond to clear commands, not vague suggestions. "Ranger free," Daniel said, using what he hoped was the right terminology. The effect was immediate. Ranger's posture relaxed slightly, and he began a careful exploration of the apartment. Daniel watched as the dog checked every corner, every potential hiding spot, his movements efficient and thorough. When Ranger was satisfied that the space was secure, he returned to Daniel's side and sat awaiting further instructions. The formality of it broke Daniel's heart a little. This wasn't a pet coming home. This was a soldier reporting for duty, unsure of his mission, but ready to serve you. "Don't have to," Daniel started, then stopped. "How do you tell a dog that he doesn't have to work anymore, that he can just exist? How do you explain retirement to someone whose entire identity was built around service?" Instead, Daniel moved to the kitchen and filled one of the new bowls with water, placing it in the corner he designated as Ranger's area. The dog followed, but didn't drink, even though Daniel could see he was thirsty. Still waiting for permission. "Go ahead," Daniel said gently. "It's yours." Ranger approached the bowl with careful dignity, drank what he needed, then returned to Daniel's side. The careful politeness was wearing on both of them, but neither seemed to know how to break it. The first few days established a rhythm of mutual consideration and respectful distance. Daniel would wake to find Ranger already alert, sitting beside the couch where Daniel slept, his bed being too difficult to navigate with his injured leg. The dog would wait patiently for Daniel to acknowledge him before moving, as if afraid that too much enthusiasm might result in another abandonment. Meals were a study in careful Etiquette Ranger would sit in perfect position while Daniel prepared his food, never begging or showing the typical food obsession of many dogs. He ate only when given explicit permission and never finished his bowl completely, as if saving some for later, just in case. Daniel recognized the behavior because it mirrored his own survival mechanisms, never taking too much, never getting too comfortable, always being ready for the next rejection or deployment or change that might tear away. Whatever small comfort had been found on the third night, Daniel woke to the sound of soft whimpering. For a moment, he thought Ranger might be hurt or need to go outside, but as his eyes adjusted to the darkness, he saw the dog lying on his new bed, legs twitching in the unmistakable patterns of a nightmare. Daniel knew those dreams intimately, the ones where you're back in the field, where threats lurk around every corner, where the people you were trained to protect are always just out of reach. He lay still, listening to Ranger's distressed sounds, and felt a familiar ache in his chest. "Hey, boy," he whispered softly, "you're okay." "You're home." Ranger's eyes snapped open. Instantly alert, his body tense with the readiness that never fully leaves. A working dog. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, caught between the nightmare and reality. Then his gaze found Daniel in the dim light, and some of the tension left his frame. "Bad dream?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice low and calm. Ranger rose and padded over to the couch, his movements still careful but less formal than they'd been during the day. He sat beside Daniel's makeshift bed, close enough to offer comfort, but not so close as to presume it would be welcomed. Daniel reached out and placed his hand on Ranger's head, fingers finding the soft spot behind his ears. "I get them too," he admitted. "The dreams where you can't save everyone, where you're never fast enough or strong enough or good." And Ranger's eyes never left Daniel's face, and something in that steady gaze suggested understanding beyond what words could convey. From that night forward, the careful formality between them began to soften. Daniel started talking to Ranger during their daily routines, not giving commands, but simply sharing thoughts aloud. He told him about the weather, about the book he was reading, about the way the sunlight looked different coming through the apartment's east-facing window. In the morning, Ranger, in turn, began to show small signs of comfort. He started drinking from his water bowl without waiting for permission. He began to rest more fully, not always maintaining the alert position that suggested readiness for immediate deployment. Sometimes Daniel would catch him simply watching the birds outside the window, his expression peaceful in a way that spoke of a mind temporarily free from duty. The breakthrough came during the second week, when Daniel was struggling with a particularly difficult night. The apartment felt too small, the walls too close, and the familiar weight of isolation pressed down on him like a physical thing he'd been pacing as much as his injured leg would allow, trying to walk off the restless energy that sometimes consumed him. Ranger had been watching from his bed, his dark eyes tracking Daniel's movements with growing concern. Finally, as Daniel paused by the window, staring out at the empty street below, he felt a gentle pressure against his leg. Ranger had approached silently and was now leaning against Daniel's good leg, not seeking attention but simply offering his solid, warm presence. The gesture was subtle but profound. The first time the dog had initiated contact, the first time he had offered comfort without being asked. Daniel's hand found its way to Ranger's back, and for the first time since bringing him home, he truly relaxed his guard. "Thanks, buddy," he murmured. They stood there together in the darkened apartment, two veterans finding solace in shared understanding. Neither of them needed to explain the weight of service, the difficulty of adjustment, or the particular kind of loneliness that comes from feeling like you no longer fit in the world you once fought to protect. A week later, as Daniel was preparing for bed, Ranger made another unprecedented move. Instead of settling on his designated bed, he approached the couch where Daniel slept and looked up at him with a question in his eyes. "You want to come up here?" Daniel asked. Ranger's tail gave a tentative wag. Daniel patted the couch beside him. "Come on then." Ranger jumped up with careful precision, settling beside Daniel but not touching, still respecting boundaries even as he pushed gently against them. But as the night wore on and both of them relaxed into sleep, Daniel woke to find Ranger's head resting against his leg, the dogs breathing deep and peaceful. For the first time in months, Daniel slept through the night without nightmares. The outside world, however, was less understanding of their developing bond. 3 weeks after the adoption, Daniel received a call from the shelter. "Mr. Hayes, this is Patricia from Riverside Animal Shelter. I wanted to check in on how things are going with Ranger." Daniel sensed something beneath the professional courtesy in her voice. "Fine, we're doing well together." "That's good to hear. I should mention though that we've had some experience with Ranger's particular needs, and sometimes the adjustment period can be challenging. His previous handler mentioned some behavioral issues, and with his age and medical needs." "What are you trying to say?" There was a pause. "Well, if things aren't working out, we do have a return policy. Sometimes it takes a few tries to find the right match, especially with our special needs animals." Daniel looked across the room where Ranger was lying in a patch of afternoon sunlight, finally relaxed enough to sleep deeply during the day. "He's not going anywhere," Daniel said firmly. "He's family new, of course." "Of course. I just wanted you to know that the option is available. These older dogs can be, well, they can be expensive, and if his hip issues worsen." Patricia Patricia Vensoms Vans. Let me be clear, Ranger is home, whatever he needs, we'll figure it out. After hanging up, Daniel felt a cold anger settle in his stomach. He recognized the tone, the careful suggestions disguised as concern. It was the same tone he'd heard from VA administrators, who suggested that some disabilities were service-connected, while others might be better addressed elsewhere. The same tone that implied some sacrifices were worth the cost, while others were simply inconvenient. That evening, as Ranger settled beside him on the couch, a nightly routine that had developed without discussion. Daniel scratched behind the dog's ears and made a quiet promise: nobody's giving up on you, soldier, not on my watch. Ranger's tail thumped once against the cushions, and in the gentle sound Daniel heard an acknowledgement, a thank you, and a promise in return. They were both learning that sometimes the best therapy isn't talking about wounds, but simply sitting in comfortable silence with someone who understands them. Without explanation, the revelation about Ranger's history came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the call from the shelter. Daniel was at the local VA clinic for his monthly check-in when he struck up a conversation with another veteran in the waiting room. Tom Bradley was a former police sergeant, recently retired, with silver hair and the kind of steady demeanor that spoke of years in uniform. Nats. A beautiful dog, Tom said, nodding toward Ranger, who was lying calmly at Daniel's feet. The VA clinic was one of the few places that welcomed service animals and emotional support dogs, and Daniel had begun bringing Ranger along for moral support. Thanks, he's a rescue from the local shelter. Tom studied Ranger more carefully, his expression shifting from casual interest to something more focused. German Shepherd, about 8 years old, silver muzzle, slight favor to the right side. Daniel straightened. You know him? If that's who I think it is. Tom leaned forward. What's his name? Ranger's face broke into a grin. I'll be damned, that's K9 Ranger from County PD. I worked with him and his handler Jake Morrison about 2 years ago on a multi-jurisdictional drug bust. His expression grew more serious. Outstanding dog, one of the best I've ever worked with. What the hell is he doing in a shelter? The question hung in the air, like smoke, and Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. The volunteer said his handler couldn't keep him when he retired. Tom's expression darkened. Couldn't, or wouldn't? He shook his head, anger evident in his voice. Jake Morrison could have kept that dog. Department policy allows it, and there are programs to help with medical costs for retired. K9 South, that son of a he, caught himself glancing around the waiting room. Daniel's hands tightened on Ranger's leash. Why wouldn't he keep him? Jake was always more interested in the glory than the responsibility. Ranger here was getting slower, his hip was bothering him, and Morrison wanted a younger dog. When the department offered early retirement for Ranger, Jake jumped at the chance to start fresh with a puppy. The words hit Daniel like physical blows. He looked down at Ranger, who was resting peacefully, trusting and unaware that his past was being dissected above him. The dog who had given years of faithful service, who had risked his life for strangers, had been discarded the moment he became inconvenient. There's more, Tom continued, his voice grim. Morrison went around telling people that Ranger was aggressive and difficult to handle, made it sound like the dog was dangerous, when really he just wasn't performing at the level Morrison wanted anymore. Daniel's vision blurred with rage. He knew that story intimately, the way inconvenient truths were rewritten, the way faithful service was forgotten the moment it became a liability. How many soldiers had come home to find their sacrifices labeled as attitude problems or failure to adapt? Where is Morrison now? Daniel asked, his voice carefully controlled. Still with the department. Got his new dog, a 2-year-old Belgian Malinois. Last I heard, he was bragging about how much better his new partner was than that old German Shepherd. Daniel's hands were shaking now, and Ranger, sensing his distress, raised his head and pressed against Daniel's leg, the simple gesture of comfort from the dog, who had every right to be bitter about human betrayal, only fueled Daniel's anger. Mr. Hayes, a nurse, was calling his name for his appointment. Daniel stood unsteadily, his injured leg protesting the sudden movement. Tom, thank you for telling me this. That dog deserved better, Tom said simply. Looks like he finally got it. The appointment with Dr. Martinez was a blur. Daniel found himself unable to focus on the usual questions about sleep patterns and anxiety levels. His mind kept returning to the image of Ranger in that shelter kennel, dignified in his abandonment, waiting with the patience of a soldier who had been trained never to question orders, even when those orders included his own disposal. Daniel, you seem agitated today, Dr. Martinez observed. Is everything all right with Ranger? Last time we spoke, you were doing much better. I found out about his past, Daniel said. His handler just threw him away like he was equipment that had outlived its usefulness. Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. That must be very difficult to hear, especially given your own experiences. It's not just difficult, it's— Daniel searched for words. It's evil. This dog gave everything he had, and the moment he started showing his age, he was discarded. And then his handler had the nerve to spread lies about him being dangerous. But he's not dangerous, is he? Daniel looked down at Ranger, who was lying quietly despite the tension radiating from his human. He's the gentlest soul I've ever met. He has nightmares about failing to protect people. but he's never shown an ounce of aggressions. Sometimes, Dr. Martinez said, carefully, learning about past trauma, our own or others, can bring up strong feelings. It's natural to feel angry about injustice, especially when we see parallels to our own experiences. Daniel knew she was right, but the knowledge didn't diminish the fire burning in his chest. He had found a brother in arms, a fellow veteran who understood the weight of service and the pain of abandonment. The thought that Ranger had suffered not just from being given up but from being maligned and misrepresented made Daniel want to drive to the police station and have words with Jake Morrison instead. He took Ranger home and spent the afternoon researching everything he could find about canine retirement policies and veteran dog placement programs. What he discovered only made his anger burn hotter. There were numerous organizations dedicated to helping retired working dogs, funds for medical care, and policies specifically designed to prevent exactly what had happened to Ranger. Morrison hadn't just abandoned his partner. He had actively chosen the cruelest possible path. That evening, as Daniel sat on the couch with Ranger's head in his lap, he made a decision. You know what, buddy? Your past doesn't define you. What that man did to you doesn't change who you are or what you're worth. Ranger's tail thumped softly, and Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger. You're a good dog, a faithful dog, a hero, whether anyone acknowledges it or not. But even as he spoke the words, Daniel noticed something that sent a chill through him. Ranger's limp seemed more pronounced than it had been. That morning when the dog rose to get water, he moved more carefully, his right hip clearly bothering him more than usual. Daniel had been so focused on Ranger's emotional recovery that he'd pushed his concerns about the physical symptoms to the back of his mind. But now, watching the dog he'd grown to love struggle with obvious pain, he realized he might be facing a crisis much more immediate than psychological healing. Over the next few days, Ranger's condition worsened noticeably. He was slower on their walks, more reluctant to jump up on the couch, and Daniel caught him lying in positions that suggested he was trying to take pressure off his right side. Sunday night, Ranger collapsed. Daniel was brushing his teeth when he heard a soft thud from the living room. He rushed out to find Ranger on his side, panting heavily, his eyes wide with pain and confusion. Hey. It's okay, Daniel said, dropping to his knees beside the dog despite the spike of pain from his own injury. I've got you. Ranger tried to get up but couldn't manage it, his back legs not responding properly. The dignity that had defined him seemed to crumble as he whimpered softly, looking up at Daniel with eyes that held both pain and shame. There's no shame in this, Daniel said firmly, his hands gentle as he examined Ranger for obvious injuries. You're not failing. You're just hurt, and we're going to fix it. But even as he spoke, Daniel's mind was racing with calculations. He didn't want to make his disability check covered rent, food, and basic utilities with very little left over. He had no savings, no credit cards, and no family to call for help. Whatever was wrong with Ranger, treatment was going to cost money. Daniel didn't have the emergency veterinary clinic was a bright, sterile place that smelled of antiseptic and fear. Daniel carried Ranger in his arms, the dog's weight a familiar burden that reminded him of carrying wounded soldiers, a weight that spoke of responsibility and trust, and the terrible mathematics of who lives and who dies. The veterinarian, a tired-looking woman in her 40s, examined Ranger with professional thoroughness. X-rays were taken, blood was drawn, and Daniel waited in a small room that felt like every other waiting room where he'd sat hoping for news that wouldn't destroy his world. Mr. Hayes. Dr. Susan Chen entered the room with a folder thick with test results. I'm afraid Ranger has a serious condition called hip dysplasia, complicated by arthritis, and what appears to be a herniated disc in his lower spine. Daniel's heart sank. Can it be treated? Yes, but it will require surgery, possibly to procedures. The hip dysplasia needs to be corrected, and we may need to address the spinal issue depending on how he responds to the first surgery. How much? The words came out as barely a whisper. Dr. Chen's expression softened. The initial surgery would be around $4,000. If we need to do the spinal procedure, it could be another $3,000. Daniel's entire year's worth of disability payments wouldn't cover it. He sat in silence, staring at the estimate while the numbers blurred on the page. Mr. Hayes, there are some options. We have a payment plan program, and there are organizations that sometimes help with medical costs for rescue dogs. But Daniel barely heard her. $7,000 might as well have been $7 million. He was going to lose Ranger, not to abandonment or betrayal, but to the simple, brutal mathematics of poverty and circumstance. How long do I have to decide? He asked. Without surgery, his quality of life will continue to deteriorate rapidly. I'd say you have perhaps a week or two before the pain becomes unmanageable, and after that. She didn't finish the sentence. Daniel knotted his throat too tight to speak. He was given pain medication for Ranger and instructions for home care, but the weight of the inevitable pressed down on him like a physical thing as he carried Ranger back to the car. The dog's trust evident in the way he relaxed in Daniel's arms. Despite his pain, Daniel made a promise he wasn't sure he could keep. Won't let you down, he whispered. I don't know how, but I won't let you down. Ranger's nose pressed against Daniel's neck. A gesture of comfort offered even in his own moment of need. It was, Daniel thought, the most heartbreaking thing he'd ever experienced. And the most inspiring. If Ranger could still offer comfort while facing his own mortality, then Daniel could find a way to fight for him. He had tooth. The question was, how do you wage war against mathematics when you have no weapons except determination and love? The call to Marcus Webb was the hardest phone call Daniel had made in 3 years. Marcus had been his squad leader in Afghanistan, a career sergeant who'd kept them all alive through 2 deployments. They'd lost touch after Daniel's injury and medical discharge, the way soldiers often do when one leaves the brotherhood and the others stay behind. Daniel stared at his phone for 20 minutes before dialing, unsure if Marcus would even remember him, let alone care about his current crisis. When the familiar gravelly voice answered, Daniel almost hung up. Marcus, it's Daniel Hayes from 2nd Battalion. There was a pause, then a whoop of recognition. Danny boy, how the hell are you? I heard you took some shrapnel and got sent stateside. You doing okay? The genuine warmth in Marcus's voice almost undid Daniel's carefully constructed composure. I've been better. Listen, Marcus, I hate to call and ask for something, but I'm in a tough spot. What do you need? What do you need? Daniel explained about Ranger, about the surgery, about the impossible mathematics of $7,000 on a disability income. He tried to keep emotion out of his voice, to present it as a simple problem requiring a practical solution, but his voice cracked when he described carrying Ranger into the emergency clinic. Danny, that's rough. Marcus was quiet for a moment. How much time do you have? A week, maybe 2, before the pain becomes too much to manage. All right, send me everything. Vet estimates, Ranger's story, pictures, whatever you've got. There's a network of guys who help each other out with stuff like this. No promises, but let me put the word out. After hanging up, Daniel spent the evening crafting an email he never thought he'd write. He told Ranger's story, the faithful service, the abandonment, the 6 months in the shelter, their growing bond. He attached the veterinary estimates and a photo of Ranger sleeping peacefully on the couch, his graying muzzle resting on a worn pillow. Hitting send felt like launching a flare from a foxhole, hoping someone would see it and send help. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus forwarded Daniel's email to a veterans network that Daniel hadn't even known existed. Soldiers who'd stayed in touch, who looked out for each other in ways the official systems never could. Within hours, Daniel's phone was buzzing with messages served with a canine unit in Iraq. Count me in $4,200. My dog pulled me through some dark times. After I got home, here's $150. Retired police canine handler. This story breaks my heart. $300 coming your way. Each message was accompanied by a small donation, rarely more than a few $100s, but they kept coming. Soldiers, police officers, firefighters, and civilians who'd been touched by their stories, people who understood that sometimes the difference between hope and despair is measured in dollars and cents, and that no veteran human or canine should face their battles alone. Daniel watched the total climb with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. By the end of the 2nd day, they had raised nearly $2,000. It was a miracle, but it wasn't enough. Ranger's condition was deteriorating faster than expected. The pain medication helped, but Daniel could see the strain in the dog's eyes, the careful way he moved, the increasing reluctance to eat or play. Time was running out. On Wednesday morning, Daniel made the call to schedule the surgery for Friday. The latest doctor, Chen, said they could wait. He put down the $2,000 they'd raised as a deposit and signed papers for a payment plan that would stretch his finances beyond their breaking point. But it was their only chance. Thursday evening, as Daniel sat beside Ranger on the living room floor, helping the dog find a comfortable position, he got the call that changed everything. Daniel, this is Tom Bradley from the VA clinic. I heard about Ranger's situation through the grapevine. Tom, hi. Yeah, we're managing to put together the money for surgery thanks to some amazing people. That's not why I'm calling. Tom's voice had an edge to it. I've been doing some digging into Jake Morrison and the department's handling of Ranger's retirement. Daniel sat up straighter. What did you find? Morrison didn't follow proper procedure when he retired Ranger. There's a fund specifically for retired canine medical expenses, and he never filed the paperwork. More than that, I think he deliberately misrepresented Ranger's condition to avoid the responsibility.